Good evening, everybody. I hope that you can see me clearly. We're just waiting for Leon to join us, but welcome to the first of a number of webinars that we're going to be performing. A big welcome to our various investors from all over the world. I see that we've got some of our investors that have signed up from Dubai, Kenya, Mauritius, some of our existing investors that are currently in the US. So a very warm welcome to all of you. It's great to see you on the webinar. Slightly different way of doing business these days. Also to one of our strategic partners, Chris Immelman from Pam Golding. Thank you very much for joining. As I said, this is the first of a couple of webinars. Many of you would have received our various COVID memos in relation to the various investments that you've made. But we thought it would be good of us to share some immigration questions that you have been posing to us directly with one of our immigration counsels, Leon Versfeld. As you know, Leon has been associated with us for many years. He's an ex-South African, currently living in Kansas City. And certainly Leon is going to be able to add a fair amount of information related to immigration during these very difficult times during the COVID epidemic. So welcome, Leon. Thanks very much for joining us, and good morning to you.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody from Kansas City. We are also on a lockdown, so I'm calling you from my home office. Things have obviously been a little bit different here in the United States for many different reasons. Obviously, trying to deal with this pandemic has been quite challenging, not necessarily just from a business point of view, but also from a family point of view. We've got some staff obviously working from their particular home offices, and it creates some challenges obviously when the kids are also not in school and everybody needs to be working from home. But needless to say, immigration has nevertheless moved forward despite this pandemic. We have seen adjudications continue to move forward despite the pandemic, and the only slowdown that we've really kind of seen is the actual in-person adjudications at the consulate as well as here in the United States.
Perfect. Leon, Rob, do you want to maybe just give us just some guidelines in terms of how we're going to deal with the webinar in terms of chat and questions? We've tried to keep a lot of our investors' information private, so we're not allowing direct questions to be posed by them. We're going to be posing them through the chat aspect of the Zoom facility. So Rob, if you want to just give us some guidelines in terms of how we're going to pose questions, and then we've got a couple of our most current popular questions, if I can put it that way, that have been posed, which we'll flip onto the page. And then Leon, we can maybe work through those initially and then try and deal with as many of the personal one-on-one questions that arise related to immigration during these times.
Absolutely.
Sure. Okay. So the question and answer, you'll see at the middle of the bottom of your screen, there's a question and answer button. So if anyone wants to put up their hand and ask a question, there is also an option to make your question anonymous. So if anyone would like to have the anonymous question, just click the anonymous button before you press enter, and then we'll slowly work through your questions as they pop up on our side. Perfect.
Thanks very much, Rob. If we could just have those questions that we've sort of been dealing with of recent. So, Leon, I hope you can see the screen.
Yes.
These are sort of the most popular questions that most of our current investors are posing. As you know, we had a wave of interest at the back end of last year, and we've got a lot of our current investors that are sort of in process. So, are there any anticipated direct impacts related to immigration timelines? And then also, if you could elaborate a little bit on the allocation of visas and how that could benefit some of our pending adjudications from an adjudication aspect.
For sure. So one highlight I can point out is that since the filing of some of these applications here towards the end of last year, we have recently received some questions from immigration, particularly pertaining to the project. We're seeing this more often now as immigration is putting great emphasis on making sure that the investor is protected and asking questions of the regional center. As part of some of these questions that we've recently got, which nothing that concerned me, it was merely kind of an exercise of kicking the tires, if you would. There was also some of you that I know that I see on the list here that there are some elementary questions just with regards to your source of funds. Give us some proof of, as a, for instance, tax clearance certificate, or maybe some more tax returns or something like that that we also going to send back to them. So number one, that was good, because it gives us an indication not only that immigration is aggressively moving forward with adjudication despite this pandemic, but the second thing is it also shows me at least that from these investors that we signed up and that we filed towards the end of last year, that these cases are already assigned to adjudicator. So the adjudication timelines, is really kind of up there. Wherein these kind of questions we typically see around the 18-month mark, 10-month, 18-month mark, whereas with these other applications that we recently filed, they came in much sooner. So I don't necessarily at this point have any reason to be concerned that there's going to be any delay in adjudication from across the board. I mean, we do obviously not just EB-5, but a variety of other immigration matters. And again, the only kind of slowdown that we've seen is dealing with the immigration, trying to deal with the logistics of people needing to come in for fingerprints, people at the consulates, and so on and so forth. But other than that, I don't necessarily see any kind of delay of especially EB-5s. Now, one of the things that Stuart touched on was some recent changes that was proposed on the regulations. And it's really kind of just a minor change in adjudication, which I think is greatly beneficial to our South African clients. Basically, how it works is, and how immigration across the board works, is it's a first in, first out kind of basis. So the guy who files now, they will adjudicate that guy's case first, and then they'll go on to the next one, and so on and so forth. But what they've recently done is they have basically looked at the visa bulletin. And as you know, from our previous discussions that we've had personally and some of our presentations, we've told you about some of the Chinese clients, Indian clients, maybe some Vietnamese clients that are backlogged. So those green cards are backlogged. And what they've done is kind of a duh moment, but what they've done is they have basically said, look, there is no reason for us to adjudicate the Chinese investor's case who was filed before Stuart's case, when after adjudicating it, there is not going to be a visa number available for him, and he's just going to need to sit and wait for the next 5 years in any event until that visa number becomes available. It is better for us to adjudicate Stuart's case, who is not subject to a backlog on the visa bulletin, and get him in and out, than it is for us to adjudicate the Chinese national. And so what this means is that even though they work on a first come, first served basis, they have basically reorganized and prioritized their adjudications to the point where they are adjudicating cases or investors from non-backlog countries first, before they would otherwise look at the countries that are backlogged.
Great, thanks, Leon. Leon, I mean, we haven't had the case as yet. How do you think the consular aspect will be dealt with? I mean, if we had an adjudication that came through, and unfortunately we were still in the current scenario, would that sort of slow down the consular process, do you think? Or do you think that they would by then have designed mechanisms to allow people to formally present themselves at the consulate and be eyeballed prior to getting their temporary immigrant visas issued?
So right now, here's the current status, is the consulate is closed. I've got a link that I can share with you guys to kind of keep track of consulates around the world on when they open. And, because not all the countries, consulates around the world are closed. Some of them may have since closed since I last checked. But as for instance, we had some guys from Mexico that processed their cases, believe it or not, and they came on over recently, I want to say 2 weeks ago, but I think since it's closed. But here's basically what's going on. Some of you that I noticed that is on the call, we are busy helping you guys go through the National Visa Center process. So this means that your I-526 case has been approved. USCIS has sent this to the National Visa Center, and we are now finalizing that last part so that the National Visa Center can send it to the consulate. And how this works is it just works as a machine. So there's no individual interviews being scheduled. So the NVC will do its thing. It will get the case prepared and basically reach out to the consulate in question and say, I have 50 cases ready for you guys to interview. And the consulate will then just systematically say, all right, in the month of May, we have these time slots available, and all of those cases will just randomly fall in those time slots. However, it's now created a backlog within the consulate because it's closed without being adjudicated. And so we don't know necessarily at this point in time of some of the cases that has been scheduled has been canceled without a specific date on when the next interview is going to happen. So I'm not concerned about that. All it means is that my case is getting personal attention, other than it being just slipped into a system. It's getting personal attention because the officer consulate actually has to go physically, individually go look at those cases and get them rescheduled on the calendar once everything opens up. However, what we've seen here in the United States happening on these kind of cases that is typically invited in for an interview is that without there being a specific reason for an interview, as for instance, any other employment-based cases, like this is an employment-based fifth preference category, on the EB1s, EB2s, and those kind of cases that is typically also invited for interviews over here, that immigration has basically gone about and adjudicating those cases. I mean, their officers are still at the office working from home, but they're just not able to interact with clients. So I don't know whether or not, and I'm hopeful at least, depending on how long this is still going to take, and depending on your country, that may close the consulate longer than other countries. And I'll get to an example here in a second. But I don't know whether or not the consulate may, in some cases, do something similar to what the USCIS is doing in the United States, where they will kind of reach out to the investor and say, hey, look, we've reviewed everything that we have. We don't necessarily have any questions. We've got your medicals. Mail us in your medicals, which the doctor would have done in any event. We've got your police clearances. We don't really have any issues. Please send to us in a secure way your passports so that we can process that and get it back in your passport. I think a lot of that also has to do with regards to the logistics of when you're going to need to travel and whether or not there's travel restrictions. So all of this will kind of play a role with regards to whether or not they will implement something like that. Now, what we have done and have started talking about is by looking at this link that I will need to figure out a way to share with you guys, where the US consulates across the country, across the world are still open. We've been able to navigate or started talking about navigating some of our investors to a different consulate. So let's say, for instance, you are in South Africa, but let's say Dubai is open for business, that we will reach out to the NVC and tell them to perhaps send your file to Dubai in order to process it over there. But those are under extreme circumstances under which we could pursue something like that.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, that's a major challenge for us because our airlines are totally shut down. So we're very much, from a South African perspective, stuck in South Africa, but certainly a lot of our investors that are outside of Africa may well be able to attend their consular interview at a consulate that is still operational. Leon, just a couple of questions that are coming through. Does South Africa have a backlog, or is it a non-backlog country?
No, the only three countries right now is China, Vietnam, and India.
Perfect, great. Leon, if we just move on to the other one, a rather sensitive one, but obviously we have got a number of investors who are concerned about the implications in respect of the principal investor unfortunately passing away prior to being approved. If you want to just talk through those dynamics, we have dealt with it here, but I think it would be great for you to talk through the implications of a primary investor passing away prior to approval, and then secondly, the investor passing away post-approval, but not necessarily at the point where they have got their unconditional green card.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a very common question. I'll just reiterate for those of you who have missed this very important question for estate purposes too. The law is pretty clear about what happens when the principal investor passes away. So any derivatives that passes away obviously would not have any effect on the pending EB5. So the first application, the I-526, which majority of people are at, that filed here recently, while that is pending, the law says that if any one of the derivative, if the principal passes away, so in other words, before approval of the 526, that application gets lost and all the derivatives do not get any benefit. But the exception to that is unless the derivatives, either one of them, have been in the United States while the I-526 was pending when the principal applicant passes away. So an example, I have a principal investor who is a doctor in Pretoria, and his son is here at the university, going to school, albeit on a student visa. The doctor passes away. He is the principal investor. Because his son was in the United States when he passed away, not only does the son continue under the law to gain the benefit under the pending I-526 to ultimately get green card, despite the fact that the principal investor passed away, but also the derivative beneficiaries, mom and sister, who remain in South Africa. So it only requires one of the derivatives to have been in the United States when the principal investor passed away while the I-526 is pending. Is that clear as mud?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Leon. Very common question at the moment is we've obviously got a number of family units that are broken up in the case where half the family may have already relocated to the US, the other half have remained here for business activities. They find themselves now in a lockdown period and obviously concerned around travel and concerned around making sure that they maintain the green card status in respect of showing intent by being in and out of the US. So we talk around that 180-day issue, Leon.
Now remember, the 180-day is really, what we talked about is a presumption, right? And so the investor and or any derivative who has been out of the country for more than 180 days there is a presumption, a rebuttable presumption, that the person may have abandoned their permanent residency. And so you have the burden of proof to show I have not abandoned my permanent residency by giving some reasons if you don't have a re-entry permit. Well, COVID-19 is a pretty good reason as to why you have not been back in the country for more than 180 days. I don't necessarily see that even becoming an issue and or a question when you re-enter the country post 180 days, during this pandemic. I don't think it will affect it one way or the other.
Perfect. Leon, and then obviously we've had a number of our investors who are approved, have activated their green cards, but obviously are still waiting for the green cards and their social security numbers to be issued. Now we know that the USCI has had a bit of a breakdown in respect of them moving from a manual to a cloud system. Are there any updates in respect of those green cards and social security cards that have not yet been issued? And is there anything that our investors need to be concerned about, or is there anything that during the COVID downtime that we could do to have those matters resolved with immigration?
So no, this has been a little bit concerned. I was just wanting to double check with my assistant who is on top of that. There is something that the Consolidated Consular Document System is a fancy system that they came up with, shortly after some of the initial applications was adjudicated. And it basically did away with that sealed envelope that you would typically take as an immigrant coming into the United States with your passport. You hand the sealed envelope to the immigration officer and then they process your green card. Well, they went onto this fancy electronic system and the system failed. And so what they have subsequently done is there is a variety of guidance that they have given with regards to solving those problems. It's obviously created kind of concerns with some of the folks who come over here and has left on the actual production of their green cards. And so we have, in fact, quite a few of these folks have subsequently gotten their green cards in the mail. And we have been tracking, and thank goodness, you know, we've got a very good relationship here. Being in Kansas City, the National Benefit Center that generates all the green cards for everybody in the country is located here in Kansas City. And we have a very good relationship with them. And what we've done is we have actually reached out to some of our local immigration folks here to try and see whether or not they can help us alleviate some of these issues. They have identified, at least at this point, that there has been a breakdown between the consulate and the USCIS as far as producing those green cards. And so what they've done is they have, on a national scale, basically, once this inquiry has been made, requested people to make an appointment at the local USCIS office, which in of itself is almost impossible to make for those of you who've tried, and then actually show up. Well, the problem is most of the folks have already left. So we have reached out to some of those folks, and if you have that issue and you need our help, please reach out to us. And we have asked for basically original signed documents again, because believe it or not, we've been your attorney all along, all through this process, and now all of a sudden the system does not recognize you. It doesn't recognize us as your attorney. So when we make an inquiry on your behalf, they're like, well, we don't see you as the attorney of record. And so it's created, you know, this extra frustration on our end in order to get with investors, to get new G28s and so on and so forth, to actually communicate with immigration.
Yep.
But we've got a pretty good system in place now in providing them with some information. Now, the processing of those green cards, we're still checking at about 4 to 9 months for those cards to still spit out on the side. And I give you that wide range only based upon, you know, some of the folks that we've already sent information on and that we've asked immigration to update their system. Some of the folks who've come in subsequently, we haven't seen any problem. It seems like they've got their consulate computer system sorted out. But here's what is very important that I think that people who are having this issue needs to understand. When you come in with your immigrant visa sticker, that visa sticker is good for 6 months. It only means that you have 6 months to come into the country. That's all it means. Once you set foot into the country, there is an actual stamp that will be stamped right on the same page or the opposite page of that visa sticker. And because of the endorsement on your visa sticker, it says with that stamp, your visa, your entry or permanent residency is automatically extended for 1 year. So within 1 year, you can go back and forth without an actual green card. All right. Now you asked the question, well, Leon, in some of these cases, the green card may even take longer than a year. And what happens if that case happens? Also relatively straightforward. We make an appointment at the local office upon your next entry. And what we do is we ask them to then produce for us a card, which is the I-551 card that they produce in their deal. It has an embossed stamp in it, and you put that card in your passport. So ultimately, you will still have a 2-year conditional permanent residency, despite the fact that you don't have the actual green card in place. And so each person's case is unique, is individual. And I just ask that you reach out to us because, you know, what applies to one person may not necessarily apply to the other person, but we've got a solution to at least give you guidance on how we would go about getting you at least the ability to go back and forth and while you're here, show legal proof of your permanent residency in the United States while this green card situation is sorted out.
Perfect. Leon, thanks very much. The next sort of 2 questions are sort of now going into risk elements related to the specific investments that some of our investors have made. And we wanted to try and keep this webinar as much more focused on immigration questions that we could possibly pose to Leon. As I mentioned in the preamble, we have already sent you COVID memos. We're very fortunate that construction is regarded as an essential service. So on all the sites where we've raised EB5 money, construction continues. All the senior loans are in place, so we don't expect there to be any major dramatic slowdowns in respect of the construction aspect related to those projects. And that's also very critical in respect of the requirements in respect of the job creation aspect of it. So we think that there's nothing to be too concerned about that. We will be holding separate webinars related to the various investments that you've made. So if you made an investment into Hollywood Circle, we'll be having a separate webinar with the developers of Hollywood Circle where they can talk through the current scenario, similarly with Block 40, and some of the other developments that we have been involved with. So those are separate webinars that will be coming through in the next couple of days as we line them up. I think what we're going to do now, Leon, is maybe go into some of the Q&A, and for all of our guests that are on here tonight, now's the opportunity to start typing them out. I'm going to start from the top, Leon. Some of them we may or may not have dealt with.
Okay.
This is not related to an EB5, but how long will it take for our son's F1 visa to get their green cards, as the principal applicant has been approved and has received their green card? I'm not sure.
Okay, so let me see if I understand this question correct. The sons who are currently here on F1, if the principal applicant gets approved, the principal applicant would process their green card in South Africa.
Correct.
And just logistically wise, I mean, we can do it two ways, but logistically wise, it would be best for the kids, once the interview is set up, for the kids to travel to South Africa and process everybody's green cards at the same time and come on over. If you don't want to use those logistics, it's just getting a little bit complicated, but there's a way around it where we can process the kids in South Africa, the kids in the US, and we can then process the rest of the family in South Africa. But there will be a delay and it will just be a little bit complicated. So the easiest and quickest and cheapest way is to have the whole family unit do it at the same time. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I think it does, Leon. But certainly, yeah, I mean, it can be done. It's better to have it done as a family unit here at the consulate, or alternatively, there are mechanisms where the kids could remain in the US without breaking their studies.
Yes.
Another question, are we a non-backlog country? I think we've answered that one. We are indeed, which is great news for us.
And just on that subject, I don't see us becoming a backlog country. I mean, you know, these countries that are backlogged are countries with populations of close to 1 billion people. And so percentage-wise, I just don't see us, you know, reaching the backlog. But anyway.
Correct. Another one of our investors, we submitted around 18 months ago. We should have received by now something in respect of our application. Leon, I would imagine that at 18 months, we should be very close to an adjudication if we look at our average processing timelines, which are roughly between 18 and 20 months. So I'm not sure who they are, but they certainly would be very close to a final adjudication on their file if they've been submitted for 18 months.
Yeah, I think if we're at the 18-month time frame, I mean, this is kind of, remember, you know, when we first talked about these time frames, if you are invested in an approved regional center that has exemplar status, that is kind of where these timelines come in. If it's been 18 months, I would recommend that we just wait until we get into the time frame of the 18-20 months. And then we can always make an inquiry to immigration. I can anticipate immigration at least giving us some feedback that says the case is currently with an adjudicator, or hey, you need to wait and we'll get back to you. It's kind of a blanket you know, response that we typically get. But there is a 30 to 60-day follow-up on those inquiries that we do. We typically don't bother immigration too soon about these inquiries, because if you go look on their website, they would typically tell you that these cases take about 40 months to adjudicate. So I would recommend on the investor who said, hey, we've got 18 months in, let's maybe wait another month or two. Even if we get an approval right now, I don't necessarily think it's going to, you know, speed up anything that we currently need to do from here on forward.
Yeah. Then we've got a question from Chris that relates around risk aspects related to the development. Chris, as I mentioned, construction is regarded as an essential service at the moment. Certainly on all our sites, the contractors are still aggressively working. On all the developments that we're involved in, they've got confirmation that the senior debt, i.e. the bank, is still very much in place, and that drawdowns in respect of payment to contractors and subcontractors will continue. So, but we'll be dealing with your specific case and the development that you're involved in directly with those developers. We will be holding a separate webinar. Then another question, Leon, what is the procedure to add another derivative, i.e. a baby? Well, that's great news.
Pretty
nice to have a new member to the family.
That happened before. Pretty easy. We just add them.
Just add them. Yeah. Somebody, just to recap, as we prepare you for the consular process, we normally revisit your family unit just to make sure that there haven't been any changes. In other words, you've either remained married, possibly got divorced during this COVID time where we were all cooped up together. And in your case with the baby, certainly we would just simply add the baby on as a derivative, and they would form part of your unit and be approved. One of my favorite investors, the Swanepoels. We're still waiting for approval. How does COVID affect it? I think, Sean, you may have logged on a little bit late, but we've done a full recording of this webinar, so we'll be sharing it with everybody. And certainly we're not going to duplicate, but for all intents and purposes, COVID-19 is not having any impact at this stage in respect of adjudications. You're still a way off. TAP, he filed in December 2018. What can be expected? Similarly, TAP, I think that your file should be pretty close to an adjudication. Leon, what is your take?
Yeah, I mean, again, I would say nothing really happens. You know, there are some situations where things go really fast, and I'm happy when that stuff comes through, and I communicate with your when that stuff happens and when there's any action. But if there's nothing going on for 18 months, that's normal. If something doesn't happen on month 18 or 19, you can shoot me an email and we can, kind of make a determination whether or not we might want to just a soft inquiry with immigration. But again, these timelines, despite the COVID-19, are estimated timelines based upon other adjudications that we have seen. Investors who have forced these timelines in the past on USCIS has wasted a lot of money. In recent times, there was a class action filed by a bunch of investors who said, well, USCIS, you said on your website that, it will take 36 months. After spending a lot of money and time, immigration just said, all right, well, those are kind of our estimated time frames, but if you're going to force us to do something, we'll just extend those deadlines. So you will see that they currently on their website propose, 40 months or longer on expedited time. So it's kind of a sensitive time, when we are making an inquiry and to kind of get some feedback. Obviously we want to get this stuff moving along. When we get feedback, we get an idea of whether or not it's at least with an adjudicator or not. One thing that I may want to just add to it, just for comfort purposes, is the fact that, we've got a good idea of where cases are at and whether or not cases are being looked at by looking at other investors who are similarly situated. So if you are invested in a program, I can say, hey, look, we've had some other investors from a similar program going through the process and or having questions and so on and so forth. So I know that all of those files has already been assigned to a team within USCIS. So I can give you kind of a guidance of where that is. There are very few that are not exemplar related that are taking much longer than these time frames that we are talking about.
Yeah, certainly, Leon. I think certainly on the couple of adjudications that we've had recently, it would seem as if a single adjudicator is appointed to a specific project, because they seem to be coming through in batches in respect of either RFEs or approvals. So certainly that's a great a good sign for us. Quick question, are adjudicators local or do they reside in the US? I wish they were local because I would harass the living hell out of them, but no, unfortunately, they are based in the US and typically they are assigned to a field office. Am I correct, Leon? They sort of share their files.
Working in Washington, D.C. And, you know, I don't know with the COVID thing, whether or not, you know, they've got some folks working from home, obviously, but all of these guys are typically working out of the D.C. office.
Perfect. Then a question from another good family investor of ours from Bloemfontein, Michael. How many months do we need to do the first consulate meeting, and or is it once you have been approved for the green card? Leon, maybe just walk through from approval through consulate process through first entry for Michael and his family.
Sure. So under normal circumstances, we will be waiting until we get an approval. That will come in a form of an email, or I'll get a notice from immigration that says, hey, the case has now been approved. We will be sending you an approval in the mail. That takes another week or two. And then we will be notifying the NVC. So there's about a 3-month time frame, believe it or not, for them to actually get it to NVC, for NVC to reach out to us and say, hey, we got this approval notice. And then NVC will reach out to us and tell us what they need. It's information that we already have preemptively asked of you, birth certificates, marriage certificates, and so on and so forth. And at that point in time, you know, we will then get into the police clearances and completing extensive documents in preparation for the consulate. So it could take 3 to 6 months just for us to get prepared and lined up to get a consulate interview. And the consulate interview will be sent. The NVC will tell us, hey, we sent your case to the consulate, and then Johannesburg will reach out to us and say, we've got an appointment slot for you next month, 2 months away. So it's not something that they will say, hey, we've got, you know, a week away from now. So they will give you ample time. And during that time, then we will finalize the medicals because we don't want to have that expire, and then set up a time and a call where we would go over exactly what to expect for that interview. Once you go for the interview, this is some, you know, simple questions that are being asked of you. They keep your passports, and a week later, they return those passports with an immigrant visa sticker that's good for 6 months. That allows you to enter the United States within 6 months under normal circumstances.
Great, thanks, Leon. And then Chris is one of our pending investors who's in the process of finalizing. And his question is, once the investment is done, does the investor need to reside in the USA, or are there specific time frames? So Chris, Leon, for your information, would be an investor who without doubt would most probably make application for a re-entry permit. So if we could just reiterate to Chris that once he's approved and once he's made his first entry into the United States, we would then sit down with him as a family unit, we'll understand exactly what his objectives are. And if it was that he was going to remain in South Africa to continue with his business activities, it would most probably be our advice that he makes application for a re-entry permit. If you wouldn't mind just elaborating on the merits of a re-entry permit for Chris.
Sure, Chris, just, you know, taking your question literally, once you make the investment, you don't need to reside in the United States. Taking it further where Stuart was heading, once you get your green card approved, there is a requirement, and we touched on this just a little bit earlier, wherein there's going to be a presumption, a rebuttable presumption by immigration that if you are not in the United States for 180 days or longer, or sorry, if you've been out of the United States for 180 days or longer, that there's a presumption that you've abandoned your permanent residency. Well, this presumption is rebutted through a couple of things, obviously showing an intent, and that could be a conversation and or, you know, quite an extensive amount of documents depending on who you meet at the consulate. But to preemptively just do away with that, we have, for many of our investors, filed re-entry permits. And what that does is preemptively tell immigration that you may not be back in the United States for the next 2 years. You know, I mean, this re-entry permit is not isolated just for investors. You know, we do that quite a lot for some of the people that we represent in the sports industry who's got a contract to go play soccer in Europe. And I mean, the whole family unit can't be traveling back and forth to the United States, you know, every 6 months. So we do a re-entry permit. it takes about 3 weeks, I would say 2 to 3 weeks, from an entry. I need for you to be in the United States to process that application, because you physically need to be here to do fingerprints. And then once you do your fingerprints, you can leave. We will then process it over here and FedEx those re-entry permits to you. So within that 2-year time frame, when you then re-enter the United States, you would use your re-entry permit. It looks like a little passport booklet with your green card and your South African passport to re-enter. No questions asked. Nobody's going to ask, hey, have you abandoned your permanent residency? Have you bought property here, and so on and so forth, because you've preemptively told them ahead of time.
Leon, then this is actually a really good question. As you know, just before the Senate went to vote on the stimulus program, there were a number of people reporting that there was a possibility that the EB-5 could be reduced down to 450 as part of the stimulus program. If you wouldn't mind just killing that thought process right now. It's just...
Yeah, so I mean, this is an article that got picked up by Politico, and there was some talks about it, because look, the American economy can obviously be stimulated by increasing the amount of EB-5s, by creating jobs, which this project does, and obviously attracting a lot of clients when you or investors when you bring that down to 450. So in principle, it sounds great, but the killer of it is the Chinese. When you look historically on how many of the Chinese people have invested into this program, it's oversubscribed. And that was the thing that killed the bill right away. I mean, Senator Lindsey Graham, basically said that's a non-starter. They need to figure out a way to kind of get around that if possible. And I think, you're going to get into some discriminatory issues, and they've got all kinds of other stuff dealing with. If the president is saying that this is the Chinese virus, I mean, that in of itself could tell you, what problems he can face by introducing a bill or approving a bill that excludes the Chinese. I mean, so I don't necessarily see that bill going anywhere right now. And I haven't heard anything, subsequent, other than the fact that it died right as it was introduced.
I think it was just really somebody wanting an opportunity to be on a soapbox. Another one of our investors, please confirm our sons study in different states. Will they receive in-state tuition fee status? Yes, I mean, once you're a green card holder and they're green card holders, they would be eligible for in-state tuition fees dependent on the state that they live in. So they could live in separate states. Am I correct, Leon?
Yeah, so look, I think you need to distinguish here between the outrageous international student fees that you're paying in order to get a student visa. That is the most amount of money that you will pay for an education in the United States as being a foreign student. As a permanent resident, you are not an international student. So, all the applicable fees and stuff that would apply to a US citizen or a local resident would apply to someone who's got a green card. And each school is obviously different on how they deal with it, but you'll save a significant amount of money of having your child be a permanent resident versus being here on a student visa.
Yeah. Another anonymous question with regard to the economic environment. Do you think that the EB-5 will be in jeopardy going forward, or is it seen in a greater light as a possible income stream for the US? Do you think those invested would be seen as assets to the US investment? Certainly, I mean, that's the whole nature of the EB-5 investment visa program, is that you are providing capital injection into the United States, and that you are indirectly responsible for the creation of 10 jobs. So yes, certainly going forward, EB-5 investments will remain, and certainly those being adjudicated and awarded green cards through the EB-5 program are going to be absolutely welcomed into the US without any doubt. Does the 180-day rule only apply for the principal investor or for each green card holder? That's a really good question, Michael.
Yeah, it's for each green card holder. Look, once we go through that consular process, each individual person in that family unit will become their own independent jockey. And so it is possible that the principal investor, may meet the residency requirement, but his spouse doesn't. And so that means that spouse is going to have issues, but the rest of the family may not. Yeah. The same goes for if little Johnny gets himself into trouble after having a green card. His green card may be in jeopardy depending on what kind of trouble he gets himself in, but the rest of the family unit won't. So short answer to the question, each one needs to individually qualify. We don't do re-entry permits typically for the whole family unit, but each person's and each family unit's circumstances, would justify who needs re-entry permits and who doesn't.
Perfect. Leon, and then a question from one of our Kenya investors, and I must just tell him, if he's listening, I have such great memories of going to the Masamara after meeting with you in Kenya. We had an absolute great time. I really would love to come back to Kenya once the COVID's all over. But his question is, his application was done in August of 2019. And what happens if his kids turn 21 by the time they get approved? And obviously, what are the implications in respect of COVID and the children possibly aging out between adjudication and managing to get to the consular process?
So, once we file this application before the child turns 21, the child is protected under the Child Status Protection Act. And it's a complicated kind of calculation to be made, at some point in time. But basically, it freezes that child's age for purposes of immigration. So he may, let's say this takes forever and ever, and he may ultimately end up being 22 by the time this case is approved. There's a calculation made under the Child Status Protection Act that will take place in order to then get into being still under 21 for purposes of immigration to process and finalize at the consulate. We've had some cases where it's been really close, for timing purposes, and the NBC and the consulate has been very gracious with regards to expediting some of those cases under those circumstances where we've got a child potentially aging out. Yeah. But yeah, the COVID situation, I don't see that that's necessarily going to affect the situation.
Leon, in his case, his kids are actually currently studying in the US. So, that could pose some additional opportunities in terms of them remaining in the correct legal status over there. Then, Leon, I think one of our final questions, we're sort of, and the final question is one of our long-standing family units. What is the current adjudication timeline on the I-829s, Leon? Do you have a current?
Let me quickly have a look. We have filed a few, and I think some of them have been close to going on a year now, so I can quickly have a look.
Okay, Leon, while you're looking at that, I'm going to pose another question, if you don't mind. Quite an interesting one. Once the green card is issued, will I be able to work seasonally abroad? 6 months US-based, 6 months Bahamas-based. I asked the question as we have the opportunity to work for the same employer, but to move between the two countries. Does this pose any potential problems with immigration? And my gut is no.
Yeah, I think, you ultimately would just, at some point you may run into some, either a rookie who learned or heard something during his training about this 6 months out of the country situation, who may ask you some questions. But if you are staying in the country, staying in the United States for 6 months out of that year, there should be a rebuttable presumption already in place with regards to your immigrant intent. You probably would have some kind of an apartment and would probably be filing taxes. So all of that could be easily explained, upon your entry back from the Bahamas if you've been working there for 6 months.
Yeah. Also, the Bahamas is very close to Fort Lauderdale. It's a really quick flight. Just pop backwards and forwards. Lovely place there.
So answer to your previous question, they are currently estimating it between 22 and 48 months on the I-29s. We've got a couple in place. Once we get some adjudicated, I'll be able to give you some better timelines on some of the regional centers that some of your investors have been with.
Leon, and then our final question: when do we get the social security number with visa sticker or only on green card?
So, it's kind of a predicament in years why. Once we are done with the immigration process, I mean, we're pretty much done, and immigration is supposed to communicate with Social Security with regards to the production of those green cards. And we have seen that there has been a lack of communication between these two agencies in order to get these two done. Short answer to your question, you get a Social Security number allocated to you upon approval of the green card once you enter the country. What we've advised some of our clients to do is if you haven't gotten your Social Security card in the mail yet, just go make an appointment and go to your local Social Security office. Sometimes they can just process the thing in there, identify any issues that we may have and that we can resolve with immigration because they can't see you in the system for whatever reason. So typically it should work where once you enter the country, your green card is allocated, as part of that application, that they've instructed Social Security to allocate and issue you a Social Security card.
Yeah, perfect. Leon, I mean, a lot of our investors actually do walk in and just register just to speed up the process, because similarly, it can take a while for the actual physical number to be allocated to you. So in a lot of our cases, our investors simply go in and attempt to register just to speed up things, because life revolves around that Social Security number in the US.
True. One thing I want to just quickly add before I forget, Stuart, and for those of you listening, I think it is vitally important that until we get the green cards, that we do not change address. A lot of you, or there's some of you who have come to the United States now, permanently settled down and so on and so forth, and has gone about changing your address. What we've seen is because of the issues that we are seeing with immigration, that the green cards are not getting to the right place. And if a green card gets mailed to an address and for whatever reason that thing doesn't get picked up, it doesn't get forwarded to immigration, to the new address that you may allocate. Immigration has a strict policy to have the post office send that stuff back. I would recommend that if we have it in place where the green cards are going to come to our office, or Social Security cards are going to come to our office, it's far easier for me or our office to help you to keep track of that, because we know where it's going to, and we know we have the mail person come by there every day, and it's easier for us to track, because once we have it in hand, I can find out where you're at and I can send it to you via FedEx. Perfect.
Leon, and then the last question, also very favorite clients of mine, Horst and Sue, who you know well as well. When entering after 180 days of being outside of the US, where is one question as to a permanent residence, and by who are you questioned? I think they've just been on the cautious side. You're not going to be questioned unless the big badge wants to possibly ask you a couple of questions. But as a green card holder, you've got free access in and out. If he believes that you may have been outside of the US for too long a period of time, he may elect to ask you some questions around you displaying the intent that you do actually have a permanent residence in the US.
Yes, Horst, I mean, it's a very valid question, and like Stuart say, it is on a case-by-case basis. I don't necessarily see at 180 days where a guy's going to take you to the back room and ask you 50 questions about what's going on. I mean, if you've been out for a year, for sure. But I mean, you may find that even in 180 days, you come in and say, I don't know what that whole deal was, what Leon and Stuart made about. I came in, the guy said, hey, welcome back, and in I came. Even with my visa sticker, I don't have a green card, visa sticker with a stamp from the previous time that I came, re-entered back in again, no questions asked. But just in the unlikely event, the law does provide for a rebuttable presumption after 180 days if you've been absent from the United States for a preponderant, a rebuttable presumption that you've abandoned permanent residency. And the guy at the gate who's letting you in at the airport, he may ask just a couple of questions. Hey, where have you been? What's going on? And that's basically the extent of it.
Yeah. Leon, thank you very much. That has been almost an hour, which is really great. Really appreciate your time this morning in the US. It's good to see you looking well. I watch you in the mornings when you post your fitness regime coming out of your garage. I'm not as fit as you. To all our investors, both current and in process and still giving it some thought, thanks very much for your time this evening. As I mentioned, we're going to be holding some additional webinars. We are going to have another general immigration webinar where we're opening it up into a slightly bigger audience. We wanted this to be a closed audience where we can deal with our current investor base and those that are in progress. And then obviously, like I mentioned, we're going to be having webinars where we are posing some questions related around the actual investment you made directly with the developing entity that you invested with. So look out for those, and certainly we look forward to engaging with you. To my staff who've been absolutely phenomenal during this lockdown period, thank you for all your support. Thanks for all the hard work that you guys are doing in the background, especially Rob and Gavin, and for Jean, who's looking after the fort on our behalf in the US. Really appreciate your support during these tough times, and I'm sure that our investor base is equally thankful. So thanks everybody. Back to our house and back to our chores for the evening.
Thank you guys. Take
Cheers,
care.
Leon.
Okay. Bye-bye.